March 4, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin. A formation of American heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, is pushing deeper into the Reich than any daylight raid has ever gone. And flying alongside them, something that by every calculation the Luftwaffe had ever made should not exist. Single-engine American fighters, escorting bombers over Berlin itself. For the tail gunner of a B-17 at that altitude, the outside temperature is 40 degrees below zero. His oxygen mask has frozen to his face. He has watched, on every mission since October, formations of his friends fall out of the sky. This morning, when he looks off his wingtip, he sees something he has never seen this deep into Germany. A silver fighter, American markings. Alongside him, all the way in, all the way out, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, 51 years old, had spent years making a specific public promise. No Allied fighter, he had declared, would ever escort bombers this far into Germany. The physics would not allow it. The fuel mathematics would not allow it. And yet, here they were. P-51 Mustangs, silver and olive drab, 450 caliber machine guns apiece, long-range drop tanks under the wings, turning the previously suicidal daylight bombing campaign into something the Luftwaffe could no longer stop. Göring would later tell his American interrogators, in the transcripts preserved from 1945, that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was already decided. But here is what Göring did not understand. Here is what nobody on the German side understood. The airplane that killed his Air Force was not built the way it should have been. It had a radiator sticking out of its belly like a blister. It had the wrong engine for the job it ended up doing. It had a wing that could not deliver what its designers had promised it would deliver. Three engineering choices that by every conventional standard of 1940 looked like mistakes. Three mistakes that together created the single most lethal fighter aircraft of the Second World War. Today, we are not looking at kill counts. We are not looking at the romance of the silver airframe. We are doing the forensic audit. How did three choices that looked like blunders combine to produce an aircraft that outran, outclimbed, and outranged everything the Reich could put in the air? To understand what Göring saw over Berlin, we have to go back 3.5 years. To a conversation that lasted about 30 seconds, and to a decision that on paper should never have been made. Part 1. April 1940. France is weeks away from collapse, and a small group of British officials, calling themselves the British Purchasing Commission, walks into the offices of North American Aviation in Inglewood, California. Their leader is Sir Henry Self, a career civil servant sent to the United States with a specific mission. Buy fighters. Buy them fast. The request he carries into that Inglewood office is simple. Build us the Curtiss P-40 under license. As many as you can, as soon as you can. The man across the desk is James Howard Kindleberger. Everyone calls him Dutch. 44 years old, president of North American Aviation. He has built the company from almost nothing into a serious builder of trainers and light bombers. He has never built a fighter, but he has a chief designer sitting 3 offices away who has been quietly obsessing over fighter aerodynamics for years. The designer's name is Edgar Schmued. 40 years old, self-taught, a German immigrant who, according to his own later account, worked briefly at Fokker before coming to America. A kind of methodical, undramatic engineer nobody makes movies about. Kindleberger walks down the hallway. According to Schmued's own memoir, preserved in his personal papers, the conversation that follows lasts perhaps 30 seconds. Kindleberger asks whether they should build P-40s. Schmued, who has been waiting for years for a question like this one, gives an answer that will become part of aviation history. He says they should not build an obsolete airplane. He says they should build a new one. That is the entire conversation. That is the moment the P-51 Mustang comes into existence. Not in a wind tunnel, not on a drawing board, in a hallway, in perhaps 30 seconds. But what Schmued is proposing is, on its face, impossible. Kindleberger went back to Sir Henry Self and made a counteroffer that no sensible businessman should ever have made. North American aviation would design a completely new fighter from scratch, engineer it, tool it, build a working prototype, and have it flying in 120 days, 4 months. For comparison, the P-38 Lightning had taken 2.5 years. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nearly 3. Kindleberger was offering to do the same work in 1/3 of the time. The British, desperate for anything that would fly, agreed. The contract was signed in May 1940. Every fighter designer in the United States would have said the promise was insane. And later, in memoirs and interviews, some of them said exactly that. The men who had signed the contract knew all of this. They did not care, because the men in the North American design room had already been thinking about a fighter for years. They had ideas, they had sketches, they had opinions about what every other fighter in the world was doing wrong. They were about to prove those opinions on the ramp at Mines Field. The prototype was designated NA-73X, civil registration NX 9998. It was rolled out onto the ramp at Mines Field, the airfield that today is Los Angeles International Airport, in what North Americans' own records call 102 days. It was rolled out with the wrong wheels. The proper landing gear had not arrived. So the ground crew had bolted on wheels borrowed from an AT-6 trainer sitting elsewhere in the factory yard. It was rolled out without an engine. Allison had not delivered the V-1710. The engine bay sat empty, and it was photographed for the newspaper reporters gathered outside the hangar with wooden dummy exhaust stacks nailed into the empty cowling. So it would look, in the black and white press photographs, like an airplane. It was an idea about an airplane. But it was an idea that had been built in 102 days. When the engine finally arrived, when the freelance test pilot Vance Breese climbed into the cockpit on October 26, 1940, and taxied out for the first flight, the aircraft was airborne. For 5 minutes, he landed. He checked it. He took it back up 10 minutes later. And the men who had built this thing knew, before Breese was even back on the ground the second time, that they had something strange on their hands. Strange because of what was hanging under its belly. Because Edgar Schmued, under the pressure of the deadline, had made a decision that every other fighter designer in the world would have called a mistake. He had put the primary radiator in the worst possible place. Not under the engine, where the Curtiss P-40 put it. Not in the wing roots, where the Supermarine Spitfire put it. Not tucked flush with the fuselage, where every drag calculation of the era said it should go. He had hung it in a large, prominent scoop below the fuselage, well behind the cockpit, sticking down into the airflow, visible from 100 yards away. The British accepted the aircraft anyway. The first production contract was signed. 320 airframes, designated Mustang Mark I by the Royal Air Force. But inside the community of American fighter designers, there was a quiet assumption that North American had gambled and lost. And then, on the fifth flight, the prototype crashed. November 20, 1940. Paul Balfour, North American's chief test pilot, was assigned to fly NA-73X for a high-speed test. According to the account Schmued preserved in his personal notes, the designer himself offered to walk Balfour through the fuel system before takeoff. Balfour reportedly declined. One airplane, he said, was like another. About 12 minutes into the flight, Balfour ran out of fuel. He had failed to switch to the reserve tank. The Allison engine quit. Balfour came down in a plowed field west of Lincoln Boulevard. The prototype, the single existing example of the airplane that would one day be called the P-51 Mustang, flipped onto its back. Total flight time on the airframe, 3 hours and 20 minutes. The program could have ended there, on a plowed field, with a designer's warning that had been waved off. It did not. The airplane was hauled out of the field and rebuilt. A new test pilot, Robert Chilton, took over the program. And when Chilton got into the rebuilt NA-73X, he wrote a note that survives in his own records. He said the airplane was clean flying. He said it had no bad vices, an airplane that every designer said should not fly. Built in 102 days, crashed on its fifth flight, and now handling better than any fighter in American service. The engineers at North American knew something the rest of the aviation world did not. They knew why the scoop was there. Lee Atwood, vice president of North American Aviation, explained it decades later in an article he wrote for Aeroplane magazine in May of 1999. At full power, Atwood wrote, the propeller of a Mustang produced approximately 1,000 pounds of thrust, and the cooling drag from the radiator was on the order of 400 pounds. Read those numbers again. Nearly half of every pound of thrust the engine produced was being spent just to keep the engine from melting itself. That was the central problem of every liquid-cooled fighter in 1940. Not how to make the engine powerful. How to cool it without destroying the airplane's performance. Most engineers responded by trying to make the radiator smaller, tucking it out of the airflow, hiding it. Schmued's team did the opposite. They made the scoop large. They made it prominent. They hung it deliberately in the airflow where everyone could see it. Because their calculations, according to the figures North American later presented to the British, said that the scoop, the thing every aerodynamicist had called a mistake, was going to do something no other cooling system in aviation had ever done. It was going to produce thrust, not reduce drag, produce thrust. If they were right, then everything the world knew about fighter design was about to change. And the source of the idea had been sitting in a filing cabinet at a research building in Farnborough, England, for the last 5 years. Part 2. To understand the scoop, you have to go back 5 more years. To 1935, to a research building at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, England. The man working there is named Frederick William Meredith. He is a British engineer, still in his mid-30s, working on a problem that the entire aviation industry considers a permanent limitation. Every liquid-cooled piston aero engine has to dump an enormous amount of waste heat into the atmosphere. The way you do it is by pumping engine coolant through a radiator and blowing air across it. That process, inevitably, creates drag. The drag is the price of cooling. You cannot avoid it. Meredith asks a question nobody else seems to be asking. What if the waste heat doesn't have to be waste? He publishes a technical report through the British Aeronautical Research Council. Reports and Memoranda, number 1683. Cooling of aircraft engines with special reference to ethylene glycol radiators enclosed in ducts. If you read it carefully, what it says is revolutionary. If the cooling duct is designed correctly, with a carefully shaped intake, a diverging chamber to slow the air down, a radiator matrix to absorb the heat, and a convergent nozzle at the back, then the hot exhaust stream leaves the duct at a higher velocity than the cool intake stream entered. And in physics, a change in momentum is thrust. The cooling system, in effect, becomes a crude, low-temperature ramjet. This becomes known as the Meredith effect. And the aviation industry, when the paper crosses their desks in 1935, mostly ignores it. Theoretical papers are being published constantly. Many of them look elegant on paper and prove useless in practice. The Supermarine Spitfire incorporates a mild version of the idea. The Messerschmitt Bf-19 later picks up something similar, but nobody is willing to bet a fighter's entire performance envelope on the Meredith effect. Nobody, except quietly in a design room in Inglewood, California, the engineers at North American Aviation. They were going to design the entire rear fuselage of the airplane around the radiator duct, every dimension calculated to extract the maximum possible thrust recovery from Meredith's 1935 paper. The goal, according to the figures Atwood put on the record, was staggering. Against 400 pounds of raw cooling drag, the properly designed duct would produce roughly 350 pounds of thrust. Net cooling drag would fall to around 50 pounds, an 85 to 90% reduction in the single largest drag penalty any liquid-cooled fighter of the era had to pay. Translated into flight performance, the Mustang could cruise farther on less fuel. It could reach higher speeds at the same throttle setting. And, in the part that would matter most 3 years later, it could carry an enormous fuel load over enormous distances. Because the airframe was no longer fighting its own cooling system, North American did not own a high-speed wind tunnel. So they rented time in the 10-foot GALLCIT wind tunnel at the California Institute of Technology. They ran the duct designs there. They refined the intake shape. They tuned the exit door. They did not treat the cooling system as an afterthought. They treated it as part of the propulsion system. Every other designer was still thinking about cooling the way you think about air conditioning in a house, as a necessary loss, as overhead. The North American team was thinking about it the way modern jet engineers think about air handling, as a potential thrust source. The Mustang Mark I began flying armed missions with the Royal Air Force in 1942, first as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft low over the fields of France. And the pilots started reporting numbers that did not add up. The Allison-powered Mustang was 30 miles per hour faster than the Curtiss P-40 at low altitude. Same engine, same horsepower, It was faster than the Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, below 15,000 feet, despite the Spitfire having a more powerful engine. How? The answer was hanging underneath its belly. The scoop. The thing every aerodynamicist had looked at and called a mistake was doing exactly what Meredith's 1935 paper said it could do. The airframe was, in effect, being pushed forward by its own waste heat. The Germans, when they eventually captured intact Mustangs and pulled them apart, spent significant time studying the duct. They never quite replicated it, not because they could not have figured out the mathematics. They had brilliant aerodynamicists. But by the time they understood how important the duct was, they no longer had the industrial capacity to redesign their frontline fighters around it. 1. Engineering mistake. 350 pounds of thrust recovered from what should have been pure loss. Men like Edgar Schmued, Frederick Meredith, Lee Atwood, Ed Hawkey. Most Americans have never heard their names. If you think their story deserves to be remembered, hit the like button. It helps the men who actually built the airplane stay in front of viewers who care about getting the history right. But the Mustang story is not over yet, because the airplane has a second, much more serious engineering mistake built into it. And by 1942, that second mistake looks like it is going to kill the program entirely. The engine is wrong. The Allison V1710, that powers every early production, P-51 through 1942, is a good engine. It is reliable. It is American. It is cheap. It makes about 1,150 horsepower at low altitude. It runs cleanly for hundreds of hours between overhauls, and above 15,000 feet, it dies. Not completely. Not all at once. What happens is that the Allison single-stage supercharger, designed for export and intentionally kept simple, runs out of capability. By 25,000 feet, the Allison Mustang is gasping, and that is a catastrophic problem. Because the air war over Europe is being fought at 25,000 feet and above. The Luftwaffe's top-line fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109F and G, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, are optimized for high-altitude combat. American and British bombers are cruising at 25 to 30,000 feet. The Spitfire Mark IX, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, works at those altitudes. The Mustang, the fastest Allied fighter at low altitude, is useless as a high-altitude interceptor. The Royal Air Force uses it for low-level ground attack, tactical reconnaissance, shooting up German trains and truck convoys in occupied France. Not the work the airframe is actually capable of. By the spring of 1942, there is a real possibility that the Mustang will go down in history as a clever airframe attached to the wrong engine. And then, on April 30th, 1942, at a Royal Air Force airfield in Duxford, England, a single test flight changes everything. The commanding officer of the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford is Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord. He has been evaluating the Allison Mustang. He has reached exactly the conclusion everyone else has reached. Brilliant below 15,000 feet. Hopeless above it. But Campbell Ord has a personal friendship that none of the other RAF evaluators have. He knows a test pilot named Ronnie Harker. Ronnie Harker, 33 years old, works for Rolls-Royce at their flight test establishment at Hucknall. He flies Merlins for a living. He knows what a properly built high-altitude engine feels like in the airframe of a Spitfire. Campbell Ord invites him down. As a favor, as friends, fly the Mustang. Tell me what you think. Harker takes the Mustang, serial number AG422, up on the afternoon of April 30, 1942. He flies it for 30 minutes. That is all. 30 minutes. And when he lands, the most consequential engineering memo of his career has already written itself in his head. The Mustang airframe, Harker writes in his formal report to Rolls-Royce, is among the best he has ever flown. It responds to the controls in a way that suggests very careful aerodynamic work. What it needs is the new Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, the same engine that is transforming the Spitfire Mark 9. Put that engine in this airframe, and you will produce a fighter without equal at any altitude. That was it. One 30-minute flight. One test pilot from the right company invited down by a friend. The entire course of the air war over Europe pivots on those 30 minutes. The memo goes to Rolls-Royce management, then to the British Ministry of Aircraft Production. Then, after sustained lobbying at the highest levels, including from Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the American Assistant Air Attaché in London, it reaches the United States Army Air Forces. The British move first. Rolls-Royce converts 4 Allison Mustang airframes at Hucknall in June 1942, designated Mustang X. Ronald Shepard, Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, takes the first one into the air on October 13, 1942. The performance is immediate and dramatic. The airplane that had been gasping at 25,000 feet is now climbing past 30,000 feet, holding 430 miles per hour of level speed. The Americans, meanwhile, have been doing the same thing independently. North America's engineering team has begun converting 2 P-51 airframes to take the Packard-built license version of the Merlin, the V-1650-3. On August 26, 1942, 3 months before the first American-built Merlin Mustang has even flown, the United States Army Air Forces places an order for 400 P-51B fighters, bought sight unseen, on the basis of the RF's test data and 30 minutes of flight time by a British test pilot at Duxford. On November 30, 1942, Robert Chilton, the same Chilton who had taken over from Balfour after the crash in 1940, takes off from Mines Field in the first XP-51B. He climbs and climbs, past 20,000 feet, past 25,000 feet, past 30,000 feet. The Merlin, with its two-stage supercharger, is doing what the Allison could never do. And then the cooling system fails. A chemical reaction between the ethylene glycol coolant and dissimilar else in the newly redesigned plumbing has scaled the interior of the radiator matrix. Chilton brings the airplane down, trailing white smoke. But before the failure, before the smoke, he has recorded a level speed of 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet, more than 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison Mustang at the same altitude. The point has been made. There is one more engineering problem to solve, and it turns out to be the smallest of the three. The original belly scoop has a subtle flaw. The intake is mounted too close to the fuselage skin. At high speed, it is ingesting the slow-moving, turbulent boundary layer that always clings to an aircraft's skin. That turbulent air disrupts the clean flow inside the duct and causes a deep, rhythmic vibration that pilots begin to call the rumble. The fix, documented in the NACA test reports, is almost comically simple. The engineers move the scoop down, away from the fuselage, by about 1.5 to 3 inches. That small gap, a few centimeters, allows the boundary layer to slip past the intake rather than be swallowed by it. The rumble disappears. The duct's efficiency improves. By the spring of 1944, with all 3 problems solved, the Mustang is about to do something no escort fighter has ever done. And the Luftwaffe pilots, who have flown against the Spitfire, against the Thunderbolt, against the Lightning, are about to find out what happens when the airplane coming after them is better than their airplane at every altitude they can reach. The men who will find this out the hard way are not statistics, they have names. Part 3. December 1, 1943. A wet English morning, the 354th Fighter Group, brand new, freshly trained in California and shipped to a base at Boxted, England, takes off on its first combat mission in the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang. A fighter sweep over France, no contact with the enemy. 4 days later, they escort bombers to Amiens. On December 11, they go to Emden. On December 13, they go to Kiel, 480 miles into German airspace. For the first time in the daylight air, war over Europe, heavy bombers on a deep penetration raid have single-engine fighter escort the entire way in and the entire way out. The 8th Air Force in 1943 has been bleeding. In October of that year, the month that includes what the crews will call Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force loses more than 9% of its bomber sorties. On the single mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 60 flying fortresses go down. 600 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured in one afternoon. The bomber crews call it the worst day of the war. The P-51 is about to change that equation, not in a year, in a matter of weeks. Between December 1943 and February 1944, the Mustang's escort range, extended by 2 108-gallon external drop tanks, moves from 480 miles into Germany to more than 700 miles. Berlin is inside the circle now. And then, on January 6, 1944, Major General James Doolittle, 47 years old, the man who had led the raid on Tokyo less than 2 years earlier, takes command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle looks at the pre-existing fighter doctrine, the doctrine that says fighters must stay close to the bombers, escort them, protect them, and he tears it up. Under Doolittle's new order, the fighters are released. Their mission is no longer to defend the bombers. It is to find the Luftwaffe, wherever it can be found, in the air, on the ground, above the bomber stream or 100 miles away from it. Find the Germans. Kill them. The Mustang has just been given permission to hunt. On January 11th, 1944, a lieutenant colonel named James Howard, 30 years old, a former Navy pilot who had flown P-40s with the American volunteer group in China, is flying a P-51 he has named Ding Hao, after a Chinese greeting he had learned in Kunming. He is escorting B-17s on a deep penetration raid near Oschersleben in central Germany. In the confusion of a heavy Luftwaffe interception, Howard becomes separated from his wingman, from his flight, from his squadron. He finds himself alone, above a bomber formation, with more than 40 German fighters in the immediate area. pressing home attacks against the fortresses below. James Howard does not run. For the next 30 minutes, according to the Medal of Honor citation and the corroborating accounts of the bomber crews who watch it happen from below, Howard engages the Luftwaffe fighters single-handedly. He shoots down 3. He damages a 4th. He breaks up successive attacks against the bomber formation, diving, climbing, turning, alone. When the B-17 crews land back in England that evening, they file reports describing a lone silver fighter defending them against what looked like the entire German Air Force. James Howard becomes the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to receive the Medal of Honor. 1 month later, February 20 through 25, 1944, the 8th Air Force launches Big Week. Operation Argument. Bombers hit German aircraft factories across central and southern Germany. Regensburg, Augsburg, Schweinfurt again, and the Mustangs go with them. All the way, according to statistics later compiled at the National World War II Museum, and still discussed by historians, Mustang pilots and their P-47 counterparts destroy roughly 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilot corps in 6 days. 17% of the trained, combat-experienced pilots of a major industrial power in less than a week. 2 weeks after that, on March 4, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group, based at Debden, commanded by Colonel Don Blakesley, a former Eagle Squadron pilot, escorts the first American bombers all the way to Berlin. 1,100 miles round trip, above 30,000 feet, silver fighters over the Reich capital. The airplane Göring said could not exist was over his city. Then there is a pilot named George Preddy, born in Greensboro, North Carolina. Slight of build, quiet, methodical. His squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, of the 487th Fighter Squadron, 352nd Fighter Group, will later write of him that George Preddy was, in his estimation, the greatest fighter pilot who ever squinted through a gun sight. On August 6, 1944, Preddy is escorting bombers to the Hamburg area. At 30,000 feet, he spots more than 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109s forming up to attack a box of B-17s below. He leads his flight in. He shoots down 6 of them in one mission. 6, a record for a single American pilot in a single engagement that stands through the rest of the war. Preddy finishes his combat career as the highest-scoring Mustang ace of the war. Final official tally, 26 5/6 aerial victories, 23 1/3 of those in the P-51. He does not live to see the end of the war. On Christmas Day, 1944, 25 years old, now commanding the 328th Fighter Squadron, flying out of a forward field designated Y-29 at Asch, Belgium, near the front lines of the Battle of the Bulge. He is leading 4 Mustangs at low altitude in pursuit of a Focke-Wulf 190 that has been strafing American positions. The chase drops down to treetop level. It carries across the front lines into Germany. Near the town of Langeweihe, in the Hürtgen forest region of western Germany, an American anti-aircraft crew from the 258th Field Artillery Battalion, 19th Corps, sees fast-moving aircraft coming in low. They have not received the notification that friendly fighters are operating in their sector. Their quad 50 caliber mount opens fire. 3 to 4 seconds of fire. Preddy's Krieps Mighty is hit. He pulls up, rolls inverted, bails out at less than 300 feet. His parachute does not open in time. The highest-scoring P-51 pilot of the Second World War, killed on Christmas Day, 25 years old, not by the Luftwaffe, not by the enemy he had faced across the sky for 18 months, by a message that never arrived. If your father, or your grandfather, or your uncle flew fighters in the Second World War, whether in Mustangs, or Thunderbolts, or Lightnings, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. The stories told by the men who were actually there are worth more than any archive. By May of 1945, when the German surrender is signed, the P-51 groups of the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces have claimed approximately 4,950 German aircraft shot down in air-to-air combat, and another 4,131 destroyed on the ground. More kills claimed by any single Allied fighter type than any other in the war. Now for the forensic verdict. Remember, the laminar-flow wing, the wing that Edgar Schmued's team designed in cooperation with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The wing that was supposed to hold smooth, orderly airflow across a larger portion of its surface, producing far less drag than any conventional wing. Here is the truth about that wing. According to post-war NACA studies, the Mustang's wing almost never maintained true laminar flow in service. Rivet heads, panel seams, paint lines, dust, battle damage, insect residue. All of it rough enough that the boundary layer transitioned to turbulent flow far earlier than the theoretical airfoil shape predicted. The wing failed at the exact thing its designers had promised it would do. But the airfoil shape itself was an exceptional high-speed design. Even without true laminar flow, the Mustang's wing gave it a tactical Mach number of about 0.78, meaningfully higher than the BF-109 and the FW-190 at 0.75, dramatically higher than the P-38 Lightning at 0.68 and the P-47 Thunderbolt at around 0.71. In the thin air above 30,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe had always held the advantage, the Mustang could push hard before the controls went heavy and the airplanes started fighting the pilot. A wing that failed at its stated purpose and succeeded at a different purpose entirely. That was the real pattern of the P-51. 3 engineering mistakes: the protruding radiator, the wrong engine, the failed laminar flow wing. Each turned out to be not a mistake, but a surprise. The radiator produced most of the thrust that Meredith had predicted in 1935. The Allison engine was wrong for high altitude, but the airframe wrapped around it was so superior that when the Merlin arrived, the combination produced a fighter nobody else could match. The laminar wing did not stay laminar, but its shape was so clean at high Mach numbers that it won battles the designers had not known they were planning to win. Now, here is the twist that most histories of the Mustang leave out. The Luftwaffe did not lose because they ran out of fighters. According to the United States Strategic Bombings Survey conducted after the war, German fighter production actually peaked in 1944. Roughly 25,000 fighters produced in the year. The Allies were bombing German aircraft factories flat. Albert Speer's emergency production program pushed the numbers higher than any previous year of the war. Germany had airplanes. What Germany did not have was pilots to fly them. The Mustang killed them faster than the training pipeline could replace them. By late 1944, The average replacement, Luftwaffe, pilot arriving at a frontline squadron had approximately 110 hours of flight time. His American counterpart had roughly 350 hours before he ever crossed the English Channel. The kill ratio stopped being combat. It became a slaughter. Goring understood this. At the end, in a way, he had not understood it in 1944. In his interrogation at Nuremberg in 1945, he told his American interrogators that long-range fighter escort was the decisive factor. He had not believed it was possible. He had said so publicly, and now he was a prisoner. The Air Force he had built from nothing was gone. The mathematics that had killed it were not the mathematics of production. They were the mathematics of pilots. And those mathematics had been set in motion by 3 engineering choices made in an Inglewood design room in the summer of 1940. The final numbers are worth saying out loud. Approximately 15,586 P-51s were built at a cost of about $50,000 each, cheaper than a P-47 Thunderbolt at roughly $80,000, a fraction of what a B-17 cost at approximately $150,000. The 8th Air Force's bomber loss rate, which had been over 9% in October of 1943, fell below 3.5% by February of 1944. A matter of weeks after the Merlin Mustangs arrived in quantity, deep daylight penetrations into Germany went from suicidal to routine. James came home with the Medal of Honor. George Preddy was buried at the Lorraine American Cemetery in France. His brother Bill, also a Mustang pilot, was killed over Czechoslovakia 4 months later. Ronnie Harker, the Rolls-Royce test pilot, whose 30-minute favor flight at Duxford had set the whole Merlin program in motion, lived until 1999. Edgar Schmued kept designing airplanes at North American. He would lead the design team for the F-86 Sabre, the airplane that would fight the MiG-15 over Korea. He died in 1985. Frederick Meredith, the British engineer, whose obscure 1935 paper had made all of it possible, never received particular public recognition for what he had done. He died with the aviation world not fully acknowledging what his one dry technical report had put into the sky. The men who changed history were not the men the cameras found. Meredith, Schmued, Atwood, Hawkey, Harker, Campbell, Ord, Shepard. None of these are household names. Goring's name is. The airplane itself, silver and gleaming at air shows, is. But the Mustang was not built by Goring. It was not built by the aces. It was built, piece by piece, by quiet men who looked at 3 engineering problems that everyone else had decided were impossible, and solved all 3, not by being clever, but by being willing to look at the problem from the wrong angle, on purpose. A radiator that produces thrust instead of drag. An engine that is wrong for its airplane until someone thinks to put a different engine in the same airframe. A wing that fails at one thing and succeeds at another thing the designers did not even know they were trying to do. 3 mistakes that were not mistakes. One fighter that, because of them, arrived over Berlin in March of 1944 and told an entire Air Force that the war was over. The men who flew the Mustang are almost all gone now. The last Second World War fighter pilots are in their late 90s. The airplanes they flew are museum pieces. But the idea that built the airplane, that a system designed whole, can beat a set of components, no matter how good each component is. On its own, that idea is not a museum piece. The side that thought about airplanes as systems won. The side that thought about airplanes as engines with wings around them lost. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this. When Goering looked up at the sky over Berlin on that March morning in 1944 and saw silver fighters escorting bombers over his own capital, he did not understand what he was looking at. He thought he was looking at an airplane. He was looking at an idea. The idea was 12 years old. It had been written down in a dry British technical paper in 1935. It had been built into an American airframe in 102 days in the summer of 1940. And it had been perfected by a British test pilot's 30-minute flight in the spring of 1942. 3 engineering mistakes, 1 airplane. The end of the Luftwaffe war is mathematics. But the men who figured out the mathematics were not numbers. They had names. Dong Hien Teet 2, Aob Kuk, J Teet CQW, 9M Goff 3, 085 PT, PII ILSLH, 6YR, Peak,